$200. That was the price her father had named for her, though he called it a dowry and not what it truly was, a debt settled with a daughter instead of coin. Leanne Zhao stood in the back room of her family's mercantile in San Francisco, the summer heat pressing through the thin walls, and listened to her father's voice through the boards as he finished the arrangement with a man she had never met. She was 22 years old, the eldest of 3 daughters, and she had spent her whole life understanding that her worth in her father's eyes had always been measured against what she could bring the family, rather than what she wanted for herself. Her mother had died 4 years earlier of a fever that took half the block that summer, and since then her father's temper had turned cold and calculating, especially where his debts were concerned. The debts had grown large. A shipment of silk lost at sea, a partnership gone sour, a moneylender named Otis Pruitt who did not forgive interest the way some men did. Her father had found a solution that cost him nothing and cost her everything. A rancher out in the Nevada territory named Samuel Voss had written asking for a wife, sight unseen, willing to pay handsomely for a woman who could keep a house and did not ask too many questions. Her father had answered that letter within the week. "You will go," he told her, not looking up from his ledger the evening he informed her of the arrangement. "The man has paid already. There is nothing more to discuss." There was a great deal more to discuss, in Leanne's estimation, but she had learned long ago that arguing with her father accomplished nothing except a longer, colder silence afterward. She packed one trunk with what little belonged to her, a few dresses, her mother's sewing kit, a small jade pendant that had somehow survived every hardship the family endured, and she boarded a train east 3 days later with a chaperone paid for by her father and a folded letter from a stranger she had not yet met. The town of Larkspur Hollow sat at the edge of a wide, dry basin in the Nevada territory, a collection of clapboard buildings baking under a sun that felt heavier than any she had known in San Francisco. The train dropped her at a platform with nothing but a water tower and a single waiting wagon, and the chaperone who had traveled with her turned around within the hour, her duty discharged the moment Leanne's trunk hit the ground. Samuel Voss was waiting by the wagon. He was taller than she expected, weathered in the way men got who spent their lives outdoors, with hands that looked like they had done real work, and a face that gave away very little. He did not smile when she stepped down from the platform. He simply looked at her for a long moment, the way a man looks at something he is committed to sight unseen and is only now discovering the shape of. "Miss Zhao?" His voice was quiet, careful, the voice of a man who chose his words the way he chose his tools, deliberately and without waste. "I am Samuel Voss." "Mr. Voss?" She kept her chin level, refusing to let the fear she felt show on her face. She had learned that lesson from her mother a long time ago, that a woman who showed her fear gave men one more thing to use against her. He did not offer his hand. He simply reached for her trunk instead, hefting it into the wagon bed with an ease that told her more about his strength than any words could have, and said, "The church is waiting. Reverend Holloway does not like to be kept past noon." That was the whole of their courtship. A wagon ride across a dusty road, a church with peeling white paint, and vows exchanged before a congregation of strangers who watched the Chinese bride with the particular curiosity of a town that had never seen one married to one of their own. Leanne said her vows in careful English, her voice steady even as her hands trembled at her sides, and Samuel Voss said his in the same flat, unreadable tone he used for everything, and when it was finished, they were married, and she had still not learned a single thing about the man whose name she now carried. That was the moment everything changed, though she would not understand how much until she saw the house he had built with his own hands. The ranch sat 2 hours outside of town, a modest house of timber and stone, with a barn larger than the house itself, and a corral that stretched toward the horizon. Samuel drove the wagon in silence most of the way, and Leanne watched the landscape shift from dry basin to rolling grassland, the kind of country that seemed to swallow the sky whole. "This is yours as much as mine now," he said, as the house came into view. It was the longest sentence he had spoken since the platform. "I built it myself, mostly. There's a room in the back that's yours alone if you want it. I won't force anything on you that you haven't chosen." Leanne turned to look at him, surprised by the words, more surprised by the fact that he had thought to say them at all. "You did not have to say that." "I know." He kept his eyes on the road. "Seemed worth saying, anyway." She did not know what to make of a man who bought a wife through a letter and a payment, and then spoke to her like she was something more than a transaction completed. She filed the contradiction away, uncertain yet whether it was kindness or simply a different shape of control, and said nothing more until the wagon rolled to a stop in front of the house. She did not know yet that Samuel Voss had a secret of his own buried in that ranch, one that would surface long before the summer ended. The first weeks passed in careful, wary silence between them. Leanne kept the house the way she had been raised to, scrubbing the floors and mending what needed mending, cooking meals from what little she knew of frontier cooking, and what Samuel showed her without much explanation. He worked the land from dawn until dusk, tending cattle and repairing fences, and in the evenings he ate what she prepared, and thanked her with a nod before retreating to whatever silence occupied his mind. She had expected worse. She had heard stories, in San Francisco, of men who bought brides and treated them as property, and she braced herself every day for the moment Samuel Voss would reveal that cruelty in himself. It did not come. He was quiet and distant and careful in a way that felt less like coldness and more like a man guarding something he did not know how to share. The first real crisis came on a Tuesday morning in the height of summer, when a neighboring rancher named Otis Pruitt, the very same moneylender who had held her father's debt, rode onto the property with 2 hired men and an expression that made Leanne's stomach turn cold before he had said a single word. "Voss?" Pruitt's voice carried the easy, practiced politeness of a man who had learned that threats delivered gently were more effective than shouted ones. "I hear congratulations are in order. A bride all the way from San Francisco. Must have cost you a fair sum." "State your business, Pruitt." Samuel's voice had gone flat in a way Leanne had not heard before, something coiled and careful beneath the calm. "My business is the same as always. That water right you've been squatting on for 3 years belongs to my land by the original survey, and I intend to see it corrected before the season turns." Pruitt's eyes slid to Leanne, standing on the porch, and something in his expression made her skin crawl in a way she could not name. "Though I suppose a man with a new wife to feed might find it easier to just sell out and move on." "The water right is mine, filed proper with the territorial office 3 years ago." Samuel stepped forward, placing himself between Pruitt's horse and the porch without seeming to make a decision to do so. "You've tried this twice before and lost both times. I don't expect the third try to go any different." Pruitt smiled, and it did not reach his eyes. "We'll see, Voss, we'll see." He turned his horse and rode off with his men, but the threat hung in the air long after the dust settled, and Leanne understood, watching Samuel's jaw tighten as he stared after them, that whatever quiet life she had imagined on this ranch had already been complicated by a danger that existed long before she arrived. "Who is he?" she asked, once the riders had disappeared over the ridge. "A man who believes the law is whatever he can afford to make true." Samuel's voice was tight. "He's held a grudge against this land since before I built the house on it. He'll keep pushing until he either gets what he wants or I stop him permanently." "And which do you intend?" Something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps that she had asked the question so directly. I intend to stop him, however that has to happen." Leanne did not know, standing on that porch with the dust from Pruitt's horses still hanging in the summer air, that this was only the first thread of danger that would pull tight around them both before the season ended. But she understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that the man she had married under duress had just stood between her and a threat without a moment's hesitation, and that fact settled into her chest in a way she was not prepared to examine too closely. The days that followed took on a gentler rhythm than the weeks before them had allowed. Leanne began rising earlier than Samuel expected, working alongside him at the corral fence some mornings before the heat grew unbearable, and though he rarely asked for her help directly, he stopped waving her back toward the house when she offered it. One such morning, mending a section of rail that had split under the weight of a restless bull, Samuel noticed the small jade pendant she wore, the one she had carried from San Francisco tucked inside her collar where it rarely showed. He said nothing for a long while, working the nails with steady hands, before he finally asked about it. "That stone, it was your mother's." Leanne's fingers found it without thinking, the way they always did when someone noticed. "She gave it to me the winter before she died. She said it was the only thing my father had never tried to sell." She turned it over once between her fingers. "I do not know if that is true, or if she simply wanted me to believe there was one thing in that house that belonged only to me." Samuel set down his hammer, studying her with an attention that had nothing to do with the fence. "Either way, it is yours." "Either way," she agreed softly. He did not press further, but something in the exchange settled between them differently than their earlier conversations had, less like two strangers negotiating the terms of a shared life, and more like two people slowly deciding to trust each other with the pieces that mattered. That evening, Samuel showed her something he had not shown her before, a small wooden box kept beneath a loose floorboard in his own room, containing a folded daguerreotype of a young woman with a serious face and careful eyes. "My first wife," he said simply, setting it in Leanne's hands. "Her name was Ruth. I have not shown that to anyone since she passed." Leanne studied the image carefully, aware of the weight of what he was offering her in showing it. "She looks like she did not suffer fools easily." Something that might have been the beginning of a real laugh moved through Samuel's chest, quiet and unfamiliar on his face. "No, she did not. I imagine the two of you would have argued constantly and enjoyed every minute of it. I think I would have liked her. I think she would have liked you considerably more than she ever liked me in our first months together," Samuel said, and there was no bitterness in it, only a kind of grateful honesty that told Leanne exactly how far he had come from the guarded stranger who had met her at the train platform. "It took her the better part of a year to trust me enough to laugh in front of me. You have managed it in considerably less time, though I suspect you would deny that if I said it aloud." "I would not deny it," Leanne said, surprising herself with how easily the words came. "I have laughed more in this kitchen these past weeks than I did in the whole of the last 4 years in my father's house." He looked at her then with an expression she had not yet learned to name, something warm and unguarded that made the small kitchen feel larger than it was, and neither of them said anything more that evening, but the quiet between them had become a comfortable one, filled with the kind of understanding that did not need words to prove itself. The second crisis arrived not from Pruitt directly, but from the town itself 3 weeks later, when Leanne rode into Larkspur Hollow alone to purchase supplies and found the door of the general store blocked before she could reach the step. The owner, a heavy-set man named Wallace Dunmore, stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, his expression unmistakably hostile. "We don't serve your kind here, ma'am. Best you turn that wagon around." Leanne had faced this kind of cruelty before, in San Francisco, but something about facing it alone in a town where she knew almost no one made it land harder than she expected. She kept her voice steady despite the tremor threatening to rise in her chest. "I have coin same as anyone, Mr. Dunmore. My husband's account is good here." "Your husband's account was good here before he brought home a Chinese wife." Dunmore did not move from the doorway. "Folks around here have opinions about that, and I run a business that depends on those same folks' goodwill." She did not cry, and she did not argue further, though every part of her wanted to. She turned the wagon around and rode home in silence, her hands gripping the reins tighter than necessary, humiliation burning hot beneath her calm exterior. Samuel was in the barn when she returned, and he must have read something in her face before she said a word, because he set down the tool in his hand and crossed the yard toward her with a speed she had not seen from him before. "What happened?" She told him, keeping her voice level even as the memory of Dunmore's cold refusal made her hands tremble again. Samuel listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening with every word, and when she finished, something in his expression had gone hard in a way that made her understand, for the first time, exactly how dangerous he could be when provoked. "That will not happen again," he said quietly. "Samuel, it is not worth a fight over a bag of flour." "It is not about the flour." His eyes met hers, steady and certain. "It is about a man deciding you do not deserve to be served in your own town because of where you were born. I will not let that stand, and I do not care what it costs me with Dunmore's customers." He rode into town the following morning and returned 3 hours later without explanation, though Leanne noticed, the next time she needed supplies, that Dunmore served her without a word of complaint, his face carefully blank the entire transaction. She never learned exactly what Samuel had said to him, and she suspected she was better off not knowing, but something had shifted in her understanding of the man she had married. He was not simply quiet and distant. He was watching, always, and he acted decisively when something mattered enough to demand it. That evening, for the first time since her arrival, they sat together on the porch after supper instead of retreating to separate silence, and the quiet between them felt different, less like distance and more like two people slowly learning the shape of each other. "Why did you send for a wife from so far away?" Leanne asked, watching the last light fade over the ridge. "There must have been women closer." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "I lost my first wife 6 years ago," he said finally. "Fever took her the second winter we were married. I told myself after that I would never let myself care about anyone that way again, because losing her nearly broke something in me I never fully put back together." He paused, his hands still on his knees, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I sent that letter to a matchmaker in San Francisco because I told myself a marriage of convenience would never carry the risk of that kind of loss. A business arrangement, nothing more." The confession settled into the quiet between them, honest in a way neither of them had allowed the conversation to be before. "And now," Leanne asked softly, "now I am no longer certain that plan is working the way I intended it to." He glanced at her, something unguarded in his expression that she had not seen from him before. "You are not what I expected when I sent that letter, Leanne. I do not entirely know what to do with that." She felt something loosen in her own chest at the words, a warmth she had not expected to feel toward a man she had married under such cold circumstances. "I did not expect any of this either," she admitted. "I thought I was being sent to a stranger who would treat me as property. I did not expect a man who would ride into town to defend my right to buy flour." "I would do considerably more than that," he said quietly, "if the need arose." Neither of them said more that evening, but something had shifted between them, a private honesty that neither the wedding nor the weeks since had allowed until now, and Leanne found herself thinking about his words long after she had gone to bed, replaying the unguarded look on his face when he spoke of his first wife, wondering what it would take to earn that same unguarded honesty again. The danger with Pruitt did not stay quiet for long. 2 weeks after the confrontation over the water rights, Samuel discovered that a section of fence line along the disputed water access had been deliberately cut, allowing a portion of his cattle to wander onto land Pruitt had long claimed as his own, land that would give Pruitt legal grounds to seize the water rights entirely if the cattle were found grazing there. "He is trying to force the issue before the territorial survey team arrives next month," Samuel said, pacing the length of the kitchen with a tension Leanne had not seen in him before. "If those cattle are found on his side of the line, he has grounds to file a claim that could cost me the water rights entirely. And without water, this ranch does not survive the next drought season." "Then we move the cattle back before anyone finds them there," Leanne said. Samuel stopped pacing, looking at her with an expression somewhere between surprise and consideration. "That is dangerous work, and Pruitt likely has men watching that fence line specifically hoping to catch me doing exactly that." "Then you will need someone who can watch the ridge while you work and warn you if his men approach." Leanne held his gaze, steady despite the fear coiling in her chest at what she was suggesting. "I am not asking your permission, Samuel. I am telling you I intend to help, because this ranch is mine now too, and I do not intend to sit inside while it is taken from us." He studied her for a long moment, something in his face shifting into a kind of respect she had not yet earned from him until this moment. "You understand what could go wrong." "I understand what happens if we do nothing," she said. "I would rather take the risk than lose everything to a man who threatens water rights the same way my father once threatened debts." They rode out before dawn the next morning, Leanne positioned on the ridge above the disputed fence line with a borrowed spyglass, while Samuel worked below, driving the wandered cattle back across the boundary as quietly as the terrain allowed. The morning held its breath, dry grass rustling in a wind that carried the smell of dust and distant rain, and Leanne's heart hammered every time a shadow moved along the far tree line. It was nearly finished, the last of the cattle pushed back across the boundary, when she spotted the riders. 2 of Pruitt's hired men, moving fast along the ridge road toward the very section of fence Samuel was working. She did not hesitate. She fired the small pistol Samuel had given her that morning into the air, 3 shots spaced apart the way he had instructed her to signal danger, and watched him look up immediately, understanding the warning before the riders had crested the last hill. Samuel moved fast, driving the last of the cattle through the gap in the fence and dropping into the cover of a dry wash just as the riders came into view, and Leanne held her breath on the ridge above, watching the 2 men scan the empty pasture with growing confusion, finding nothing but undisturbed grass and a fence line that showed no evidence of anyone having crossed it. They rode on eventually, frustrated and empty-handed, and Leanne did not move from the ridge until she was certain they were truly gone, her hands shaking now that the danger had passed, adrenaline burning through her in a way she had never experienced in her quiet life back in San Francisco. Samuel found her there minutes later, climbing the ridge with an urgency that told her exactly how much the last 20 minutes had cost him in fear for her safety. "You could have been seen," he said, his voice rough with something that was not quite anger. "I was not seen. I made certain of that before I fired." She held his gaze, steady despite the tremor still working through her hands. "And you would have been caught on the wrong side of that fence if I had not warned you in time. We are better together at this than either of us would be alone, Samuel. You should trust that by now." He looked at her for a long moment, something raw moving behind his eyes, and then he reached for her hand, holding it with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the danger they had just survived. "I am not accustomed to trusting anyone with something that matters this much," he said quietly. "I told myself, after my first wife died, that the safest thing was to never let anyone close enough to matter again." "And now?" she asked softly, echoing the question from the porch weeks earlier. "Now I find myself standing on a ridge, watching a woman I married through a stranger's letter risk her own safety to protect land and cattle that were never truly hers to protect." His thumb moved gently across her knuckles. "I do not know how to explain what that has done to the careful distance I built around myself, except to say it is no longer holding the way it once did." The confession landed somewhere gentle and unguarded in her chest, and Leanne found herself leaning into the moment rather than away from it, the summer wind moving warm across the ridge, the danger finally past, the space between them narrower than it had been at any point since her arrival. Pruitt did not give up after the failed attempt at the fence line. He escalated instead, riding onto the ranch itself 2 weeks later with 4 hired men and a folded document he claimed was a legal filing transferring the water rights to his name. Backed by a territorial judge, Samuel suspected Pruitt had paid handsomely for the favor. "This ends today, Voss," Pruitt said, his easy politeness gone entirely now, replaced by the flat certainty of a man who believed he had finally won. "The judge has signed the order. The water is mine as of this afternoon, and you have until sundown to clear your cattle off land that no longer belongs to you." Samuel stood his ground on the porch steps, his hands loose at his sides, his voice carrying none of the fear Leanne felt tightening in her own chest. "That order will not hold, Pruitt. You know it, and I know it. The original survey was filed and recorded 3 years ago, and no judge in this territory has the authority to overturn a federally recorded claim on the strength of a document you likely paid for yourself." "Prove it," Pruitt said, smiling in a way that did not reach his eyes. "Prove it before sundown, or I ride back here with the marshal and we settle this the hard way." It was Leanne who stepped forward then, a folded paper of her own held steady in her hand, the copy of the original survey filing that Samuel had shown her weeks earlier when he first explained the danger Pruitt posed. She had taken it upon herself 3 days earlier to ride into the territorial capital and have a certified copy made at the recorder's office, a precaution she had not yet mentioned to Samuel, uncertain whether it would matter until this exact moment arrived. "There is no need to wait until sundown, Mr. Pruitt." Her voice was steady, despite the fear pounding beneath it. "I have a certified copy of the original filing here, dated 3 years before whatever document you are holding, recorded at the territorial capital and witnessed by the recorder himself. Your judge's order means nothing against a federal filing this clear, and I suspect he knows that as well as you do, which means he has already broken the law simply by signing it." Pruitt's confident expression faltered for the first time since he had ridden onto the property, and Leanne watched him recalculate everything he had believed about the situation, the careful arithmetic of a man realizing his advantage had just evaporated in front of his own hired men. "You would not dare take this to the marshal," Pruitt said, though the certainty had drained from his voice. "I already have," Leanne said. "The marshal's office in town has a copy of this same filing as of this morning, along with a signed statement describing the cut fence line and the 2 riders sent to catch Samuel on the wrong side of it 3 weeks ago. If you wish to press this further, Mr. Pruitt, I imagine the marshal will have a great many questions for you and for the judge who signed that order." The silence that followed stretched long and heavy, and Leanne watched Samuel's hired men shift uneasily, watched 2 of Pruitt's own riders exchange a look that told her they had no intention of following him into a confrontation with federal law behind it. Pruitt's jaw worked once, twice, and then he folded the document in his hand with a violence that betrayed exactly how badly he had wanted this to end differently. "This is not finished, Voss," he said, though the threat had gone hollow. "It is finished," Samuel said quietly, stepping down from the porch to stand beside Leanne, his shoulder brushing hers in a gesture that felt, in that moment, like a declaration of its own. "You will not return to this property again, Pruitt, and if the marshal has questions about that judge's order, I expect you to answer them honestly, because my wife has already made certain the truth cannot be buried." Pruitt rode off that afternoon and did not return, and word reached the ranch within the week that the territorial judge had been quietly removed from his position after the marshal's investigation uncovered exactly the kind of corruption Leanne had suspected. Pruitt himself sold his land within the month and left the territory entirely, his reputation in Larkspur Hollow ruined beyond repair. Samuel found Leanne in the kitchen that evening, the danger finally, completely past, and he stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking, something unguarded and certain in his expression that she had not seen from him even in their quietest moments together. "You rode 2 days to the capital and back without telling me," he said. "You could have been hurt on that road alone." "I could have been," she agreed, "but I understood what was coming before you fully did, and I was not going to wait for permission to protect something that matters to me as much as it matters to you." "It matters to you?" he repeated, something quiet and searching in his voice. "This ranch, yes. And you, Samuel." She held his gaze, her own honesty surprising her even as she spoke it. "I did not expect to feel that, coming here the way I did. But I do." He crossed the kitchen slowly, the same careful, deliberate motion he brought to everything he did, and stopped close enough that she could see the unguarded warmth finally settled fully into his face. "I built distance around myself for 6 years because I told myself it was the only way to survive losing someone again," he said quietly. "You have been dismantling that distance since the morning you stepped off that train platform, and I no longer have any interest in rebuilding it." He kissed her then, gently, the first time either of them had allowed themselves that closeness since the wedding, and it carried none of the careful distance of the months before, only the quiet certainty of two people who had chosen each other slowly, through danger and honesty rather than romance offered easily. 3 months passed, and the ranch settled into a rhythm neither of them had known before that summer. The water rights held secure, recorded now beyond any question, and the cattle grazed the full breadth of the land without threat from Pruitt or anyone who had once shared his ambitions. Wallace Dunmore served Leanne without complaint whenever she visited the general store, and though not every resident of Larkspur Hollow had warmed to her presence, enough had that she no longer walked into town bracing herself for cruelty. The house itself had changed too. Leanne had planted a small garden along the south wall, vegetables and a few flowers she had ordered by mail from a catalog, and Samuel had built her a proper writing desk in the room that had once been hers alone, though she rarely used it as anything but her own space now, since most evenings found her beside him rather than apart. She stood on the porch one evening in early autumn, watching the last light settle gold over the ridge where she had once fired 3 warning shots into the summer air, and Samuel came to stand beside her, his hand finding hers the way it had become natural for it to do these past months. "Your father sent a letter," he said, after a long, comfortable silence, "asking whether the arrangement had proven satisfactory." Leanne felt the old bitterness rise briefly at the mention of her father's transactional concern, though it settled faster now than it once would have. "What did you tell him?" "I told him his daughter saved this ranch with nothing but a certified document and more courage than most grown men I have known." Samuel's voice held quiet pride. "I told him the arrangement proved more than satisfactory, though I doubt he will understand what that actually cost you to earn." "He never did understand much about what things cost," Leanne said softly. "But I am no longer certain that matters to me the way it once did." Samuel turned to look at her fully, the the last gold light of evening catching the quiet certainty in his face. $200, he said. That was what your father named as your worth in that letter. I have thought about that number more than I should these past months, because it never once described anything true about you. And what would you say describes it? She asked. Everything this ranch has become since you arrived, he said simply. Everything I did not know I was missing until you stepped off that platform and refused to let me see your fear. His thumb moved gently across her knuckles. I do not have a number for that, Leanne. I do not think one exists. She leaned into him then, the warmth of the evening settling around them both, and understood, standing on the porch of the home she had once feared arriving at, that the life her father had sold her into had somehow become one she would not now trade for any other, chosen freely now in a way it had never been chosen for her at the start. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.